The moment when Lucia walked down the aisle should have been the happiest moment of her life. The white dress she had dreamed of since she was a child, the carefully selected flowers, and the music she had rehearsed for months. Everything was perfect, or so she thought. The murmurs began as a whisper among the guests. At first she thought it was admiration for her appearance, but when she saw the expression in her mother's eyes, she knew something was terribly wrong. "Did you know all along?" Carlos's voice echoed through the church as she finally reached the altar. His tone, cold and sharp like an ice knife, silence fell over everyone present. "Did you think I'd never find out?" Lucia's heart stopped. Tears threatened to ruin the makeup that had taken hours to apply, but this was not the time to cry. Not here, not now. In front of 200 guests who were witnessing how the man who supposedly loved her was about to publicly humiliate her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she murmured, although the guilt she felt was evident in her trembling voice. Carlos pulled out his phone and showed a picture that would change everything. "This arrived in my inbox this morning. Anonymous. How convenient, right?" The embarrassment was instant. Heat rose to her cheeks as the whispers of the guests turned into a deafening hum. Lucia wanted the earth to open up and swallow her. The past she had tried so hard to bury was now exposed in front of everyone. "I never really was," Carlos declared with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I just wanted to see how far you would take this charade. And boy, did you take it far." The humiliation was total when Carlos turned around and left the altar, leaving her alone in a dress that cost months of savings and a broken heart that seemed impossible to repair. 3 years later, Lucia found herself drinking coffee in a small cafe downtown. Her life had changed drastically since that fateful day. She was no longer the naive young woman who believed in fairy tales. The experience had hardened her, but it had also taught her to value herself. What Lucia didn't know was that that day in that cafe, fate had prepared an encounter that would change everything again. An encounter with someone who knew her entire story but saw her through different eyes. Someone who had been present at that wedding and who was keeping a secret that could exonerate her or sink her even further. "Can I sit down?" a familiar voice asked. When Lucia looked up, she felt time stop. It was Daniel, Carlos's best friend, the man who had organized his bachelor party, the one who had always been in the shadows watching their relationship. "What are you doing here?" His voice was barely a whisper as the memories of that day flooded back into his mind. "There's something you should know about what happened that day," Daniel said, his gaze a mixture of guilt and determination. "What Carlos showed you wasn't what it seemed." Lucia's heart began to beat faster. Could it be possible that it had all been a misunderstanding? Or did Daniel have other intentions? "Carlos wasn't honest with you," he continued, "but neither was I, and it's time you knew the truth." As Daniel began to speak, Lucia felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. What she was about to hear could give her the redemption she longed for or confirm that her humiliation was part of a plan much more twisted than she had ever imagined. What neither of them knew was that Carlos was watching them from across the street with an indecipherable expression and an envelope in his hand that contained the real reason why he had abandoned Lucia at the altar 3 years ago. A secret that was about to come to light, and that would change the lives of all 3 of them forever. The cafeteria seemed to shrink around them. Lucia gripped her cup so tightly that she was afraid it would break. In front of her, Daniel seemed different from the man she remembered. He no longer had that confident smile he always carried as a shield. His eyes reflected the weight of something he had carried for too long. "Carlos and I were like brothers since college," Daniel began, his voice barely audible over the murmur of conversations around him. "We shared everything, absolutely everything." Lucia felt a chill. The way Daniel emphasized those last words made her understand that there was something more behind that friendship. The night before the wedding, Carlos was nervous. It wasn't the typical nervousness of a boyfriend. It was different. Daniel paused to take a sip of his coffee. "He confessed to me that he had doubts. Not about you, but about himself. About whether he could be the man you deserved." Lucia's memories traveled back to the days before the wedding. Carlos had been distant, but she attributed it to the stress of the preparations. She never imagined such deep doubts existed. That night someone sent an email to Carlos photos of you with your ex Alejandro. Daniel looked her straight in the eyes, but those photos were manipulated. They made it seem like you had met with him recently, when in reality they were from years ago. Lucia's heart skipped a beat. The photos that Carlos had shown her at the altar, those that supposedly proved his infidelity. She always knew there was something strange about them, but the SOC of the moment prevented him from properly defending himself. Are you saying someone fabricated evidence to sabotage my wedding? The indignation in his voice was palpable. Who would do something like that? Daniel looked away towards the window. At that precise moment, he noticed a familiar figure crossing the street. Carlos had disappeared. There's more, Daniel continued, leaning over the table. Carlos received a call that same morning. Something that completely destroyed him. He never told me what it was, but it changed him. It was as if he had made a decision that he knew he would regret his entire life. Lucia remembered the look on Carlos's face at the altar. It wasn't just anger she saw in his eyes. There was pain, a deep pain that now made sense. Why are you telling me this now after 3 years? She asked. Distrust tinged every word. Daniel pulled an envelope from his inside jacket pocket. Because I found this in Carlos's apartment 2 weeks ago. I was helping him pack for his move to Madrid. The envelope was yellowed as if it had been stored away for too long. On the front, in elegant handwriting, was written her name, Lucia. I haven't opened it, Daniel assured her, but I know it has to do with what happened. Carlos doesn't know I have it. Lucia reached out with a trembling hand toward the envelope, but before she could take it, the door to the cafeteria burst open. A woman hurried in, looking around desperately. Her eyes fell on the table where they were sitting. Rosa, Lucia murmured, recognizing Carlos's cousin. Rosa, breathing heavily and with a pale face, approached them. You shouldn't be talking, she said, in a low but firm voice. There are things you don't know, things better left buried. Daniel tensed. Rosa, she deserves to know the truth. The truth? Rosa let out a bitter laugh. Which truth, Daniel? Yours? Carlos's, or the one no one has dared to tell? The atmosphere became thick with unspoken tension. Lucia watched them both, feeling as if she were in the middle of a battle whose rules she didn't know. Carlos is back in town, Rosa added, staring at Daniel. And he knows you have the envelope. The silence that followed Rosa's words was so thick that Lucia could hear her own heartbeat. The three of them stood still, as if any movement could trigger something irreversible. How did you find out? Daniel finally asked. His voice was barely a whisper. Rosa looked nervously toward the window. He called me an hour ago. He's furious. Daniel, I'd never heard him like that before. Lucia reached out and picked up the envelope that was still on the table. She no longer cared about the warnings. 3 years of her life had been marked by what happened that day at the altar. She deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. It's my life, she said firmly. And whatever is in this envelope, I have the right to know. Her fingers were shaking as she opened the yellowish envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small black and white photograph. The handwriting was unmistakable. Carlos, dear Lucia. She began to read aloud, ignoring the look of panic on Rosa's face. When you read this, you will probably hate me more than you already do. And with good reason. The cafeteria seemed to have stopped in time. Even the sounds of rates and conversations seemed to have fallen silent. What I did on our wedding day was unforgivable. I humiliated you in front of everyone. I destroyed what we had built together, and I did it based on a lie. A lie I chose to believe because it was easier than facing the truth about myself. Lucia paused, her heart beating so hard she feared it might break again. The letter continued, but the next lines left her breathless. The night before our wedding, I received a call from my doctor. The results I feared so much finally came back. The diagnosis was clear. The same disease that took my father. I had the same symptoms, the same odds. I didn't want you to spend your life caring for someone doomed, watching me fade away day after day. So when I received those photos that are now doctored, I saw my way out. A cowardly way out. Tears began to roll down Lucia's cheeks, staining the paper as she continued reading. But life has a macabre sense of humor. 6 months after the diagnosis, the new studies they showed it was a mistake. I'm completely healthy. I destroyed you for nothing. The air escaped from her lungs as if she'd received a physical blow. Everything made sense now. The distance from Carlos in, the days before his lost gaze, the trembling in his hands during rehearsals. Did you know? Lucia asked, Daniel, her voice breaking. I knew about his illness. Daniel shook his head. I thought he'd simply been afraid of the commitment, that the photos were just an excuse. Rosa stood up abruptly. We have to go now, Carlos is here. As if her words had conjured him, the cafeteria door opened again. Carlos walked in, his gaze scanning the place until he found them. The years had not been kind to him. His face that had once been cheerful and carefree now showed lines of bitterness and remorse. Lucia felt the world shrink. Into that moment, 32 years of unanswered questions, of sleepless nights, wondering what she'd done wrong, all converging in this instant. Carlos slowly approached her table. He was no longer the confident man who had humiliated her at the altar. There was something different about him, something broken. I see you found my letter, he said, looking at the paper in Lucia's hands. Why didn't you tell me the truth? She asked, her words coming out haltingly. I would have been by your side, Carlos, in sickness and in health. Remember? Those were our vows. Carlos looked away, unable to hold her gaze because he loved you too much to drag you with him into what he thought would be hell. It took my father 5 years to die. I watched as he consumed my mother until there was barely anything left of her. I couldn't do that to you. So you decided for me. It wasn't a question, but an accusation. The silence stretched between them, heavy, with 3 years of unspoken words. There's something else you should know. Rosa chimed in, her voice trembling slightly. Something not even Carlos knows. Everyone turned to her. Rosa, always in the background of their lives, had never been the center of attention. But now something in her expression suggested that everything was about to change. The photos, Rosa said, avoiding looking directly at anyone. I was the one who sent them. The confession fell like a bomb on the table. Carlos took a step back, as if he had received a physical blow. Daniel's mouth fell open and Lucia simply stood still, processing this new betrayal. Why? Carlos's question contained decades of family trust shattered in an instant. Rosa finally looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Why? At that moment, the door to the cafeteria opened once more, and the person who entered made all 4 of them gasp. Alejandro, the same man who appeared in the manipulated photos, Lucia's ex who had supposedly been the cause of her humiliation at the altar, entered the cafeteria with a determined stride as if he had been searching for them. For days, his gaze scanned the tables until he found them. And when she did, her eyes stopped on Pink with a disturbing intensity. I finally found you, she said, ignoring the presence of the others. Her voice was cold and controlled, but there was something, beneath that control, something dangerous. Pink paled. Instantly, all traces of the confession he was about to make disappeared from his face, replaced by a primal fear he couldn't hide. What are you doing here? He managed to ask, instinctively, backing away until his back touched the wall. The tension in the air was so thick it seemed to make breathing difficult. The other customers in the cafeteria began to notice that something was happening, some even discreetly gathering their belongings to leave. Do you know each other? Lucia asked, looking between Alejandro and Rosa in disbelief. Alejandro smiled, but there was no warmth in the gesture. Oh, we know each other very well, right, Rosa? In fact, you could say we've been partners for years. Carlos took a step forward, instinctively placing himself between Rosa and Alejandro. Despite his cousin's confession, they were still family, and something about Alejandro's attitude awakened his protective instinct. Whatever's going on, this is not the place, he said, keeping his voice low but firm. Alejandro took his phone out of his pocket and placed it on the table. You're right, this is not the place, but I'm tired of waiting. 3 years, Rosa. 3 years of keeping silent while you played the innocent cousin. Daniel took Lucia's hand under the table, an instinctive gesture of protection that didn't go unnoticed by Carlos, whose expression darkened momentarily. Show them, Alejandro ordered Rosa, or I will. Rosa was visibly trembling now. I don't know what you're talking about. He tried, but his voice lacked conviction. Alejandro slid his finger along hers, the phone screen, and then turned it so everyone could see. They were screenshots of conversations, many conversations dating from weeks before the wedding to just a few days ago. Lucia leaned over to get a better look and felt the floor open up beneath her feet. They were messages between Rosa and Alejandro, messages that revealed a plan, a meticulously designed plot to separate Carlos and Lucia. We were lovers, Alejandro finally admitted with chilling calm. Rosa was obsessed with you, Carlos. Always has been. She sought me out months before the wedding, knowing I was Lucia's ex. She offered me money to help break them up. Carlos turned to Rosa, disbelief giving way to horror on his face. Is it true? His voice barely a whisper. Rosa was no longer trying to deny it. The tears ran freely down her face. It was always you, Carlos. Since we were children, I saw you every Christmas, every family birthday, watching you grow, become the man you are. And then, she appears, and in 2 years she has what I waited a lifetime for. The silence that followed was deafening. Lucia felt nauseous. All this time, her whole life ruined by the unhealthy obsession of a woman who was supposed to be family. But there's more, Alejandro continued, and there was something in his tone that suggested the worst was yet to come. The medical diagnosis. Carlos, that was not a mistake either. Carlos froze as if he had been struck by lightning. What are you saying? Alejandro looked at Rosa. Tell him how. You manipulated the results. Tell him how you bribed that lab technician to change the report. You're lying. Carlos whispered, but there was doubt in his voice. Check it yourself. Alejandro replied, sliding his finger across the screen until it displayed what appeared to be bank transfers. Rosa paid $20,000 for you to be given a false diagnosis. I knew you would stay away from Lucia if you thought I was sick. I knew you too well. A deathly silence fell over the cafe. The few remaining customers watched surreptitiously, feeling the tension emanating from that table in the corner. Carlos slumped into a chair as if his legs could no longer support him. You falsified a diagnosis of death. His voice was barely audible, but laden with a mixture of disbelief and rage. You played with something like that, with the same diagnosis that killed my father. Rosa was no longer crying. She seemed to have crossed some emotional threshold where tears were insufficient. I did it for us, she said with disturbing calm. I knew you would never see me if you were with her. She needed time. Lucia woke, up slowly. 3 years of pain, unanswered questions, sleepless nights wondering what she had done wrong. All of that, crystallizing in this moment of clarity. You stole 3 years of my life. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with a suppressed rage that threatened to overflow. Not only from me, but from Carlos. You took away the possibility of being happy. Alejandro took a step towards Rosa. What I haven't told you is why I'm here now. Her expression changed, becoming harder. Rosa promised me a portion of the family, money if I helped her. Money I never received. Rosa visibly tensed. I paid you what I agreed on. You paid me for the photos and for my temporary silence, Alejandro corrected her. But not for the hospital. That deserves other compensation. For the first time, fear was clearly reflected in Rosa's eyes. It wasn't fear of being discovered. That had already happened. But something more immediate and dangerous. This is blackmail, she murmured, looking nervously around. Call it what you want. Alejandro replied with a tense smile. But we both know that I can put you in jail for falsifying medical documents. The tension in the air was so thick it could almost be cut. Daniel, who had been silently watching the entire scene, finally spoke. That's enough, he said, standing up. This has gone too far. He took his phone out of his pocket. I'm a lawyer, remember? And I just recorded this entire conversation. Rosa and Alejandro's eyes widened in surprise. Carlos looked up in confusion. What are you doing? Lucia asked. Daniel looked her straight in the eyes. What I was supposed to do 3 years ago. Protect you. He turned to the others. This recording is evidence of forgery of medical documents, attempted extortion, and conspiracy to cause emotional distress. Enough for a formal complaint. Rosa paled. You can't do that. I can and I will, Daniel replied firmly. Unless the two of you leave right now and never come near Carlos or Lucia again. Alejandro assessed the situation, and without saying a word picked up his phone and headed for the door. Rosa remained motionless, looking pleadingly at Carlos. Cousin, please. Carlos looked at her as if she were a stranger. Go away, he said simply, and don't call me family again. Her legs trembling, Rosa followed Alejandro towards the exit. The door closed behind them, leaving a silence heavy with suppressed emotions. The three of them were left alone at the table, surrounded by the fragments of truths that had been hidden for too long. Did you really record everything? Lucia asked finally. Daniel smiled slightly and put his phone away. No, my phone has been on airplane mode since this morning, but they don't know that. Despite everything, a small smile appeared on Lucia's lips. It was the first hint of real relief she had felt in years. Carlos cleared his throat. Lucia. I began, she said, but she raised a hand to stop him. Don't say anything now, she said softly. We both need time to process all of this. She stood up and picked up her bag. 3 years is a long time, Carlos. People change. I have changed. Carlos nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. I know and I respect that. Lucia turned to Daniel, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Thank you, she said simply. As she headed towards the door, she felt a strange mix of closure and a new beginning. The truth, however painful, had finally freed her from the chains of her past. What none of the three of them noticed was the envelope that had been left on the table. An envelope that contained not only the letter Carlos had written, but also another document that would change the course of their lives again when they discovered it. Lucia had barely taken a few steps outside the cafeteria when the sky that had been threatening rain all day finally gave way. Heavy drops began to fall, forcing her to return inside. It was then that she saw the envelope that had been forgotten on the table. Daniel and Carlos remained seated, immersed in an awkward silence that seemed to contain years of unspoken words. They both looked at Lucia in surprise when she returned. We forgot this, she said, taking the envelope. Something slipped out, falling to the floor, a carefully folded piece of paper, different from the letter they had already read. Carlos bent down to pick it up but stopped halfway as if doubting his right to touch it. What is that, Lucia? He picked up and slowly unfolded the document. His eyes scanned the lines quickly and his expression changed from curiosity to absolute disbelief. It's a marriage certificate, he whispered. Our marriage certificate. Daniel stood up, moving closer to look at the document. That's impossible. The ceremony never ended. But there it was, with the official seals, the signatures of the witnesses and the officiant, dated the same day as the wedding, the day of the public humiliation. Father Ignacio, Carlos murmured, recognizing one of the signatures. He signed the documents before the ceremony. He said it was customary to do so to avoid chaos afterward. The three of them looked at each other, slowly processing what this meant. We are legally married, Lucia said, her voice barely audible. We have been married for 3 years. Carlos ran a hand over his face, visibly affected by this revelation. I never asked for an annulment because, I don't know why, Maybe a part of me didn't want to close that door completely. The silence that followed seemed eternal. The past, the present, and a possible future floated between them like an unasked question. Daniel was the first to speak. Is there anything else you should know? His tone had changed, becoming more serious. Something that he had kept for these 3 years. He took out his phone and searched for something on it. Then he placed it on the table, showing a text message sent on the wedding day hours before the ceremony. It was a message from Rosa to Daniel. Everything is ready. Carlos will receive the photos this morning. Are you sure about this? Lucia looked at Daniel with confusion that quickly turned to horror when she realized you were involved. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the floor. At first, yes, I was in love with you, Lucia. From the first day Carlos introduced you when Rosa contacted me with her plan, I saw an opportunity. Carlos stood up. The betrayal was clearly reflected on his face. You were my best friend. I know it, Daniel replied, his voice breaking, and I regretted it immediately after. These 3 years I've been trying to make amends for that mistake. That's why I kept the letter. That's why I looked for Alejandro. That's why I orchestrated this meeting. The cafeteria seemed to revolve around Lucia. Too many revelations, too many betrayals. She felt trapped in a web of lies where each thread led to a new disappointment. Why confess now? His voice asked, strangely calm. Daniel finally looked up, facing her. Because I received this today. She showed them another message on her phone, this time from an unknown number. I know what you did. The 3 of you will know soon, Alejandro murmured. Carlos. He's playing both sides. He didn't answer. Daniel. The message is from this morning. Before Alejandro appeared, she paused. There is someone else who knows everything that happened. Someone who has been watching us as if responding to an invisible signal. The door of the cafeteria opened again. A middle-aged woman entered, shaking the rain from her umbrella. Her gaze scanned the place until it rested on them. Carlos's mother, the woman who had lost her husband to the same disease her son had been threatened with. I see the truth has finally been revealed, she said as she approached their table. Her voice was soft but firm, loaded with a determination that only a mother could have. She looked at the marriage certificate on the table and smiled slightly. She knew that saving this would be worth it someday. Me.